Federal courts quietly changed the rules on guns just days before Christmas, and most Americans still have no idea what just happened. Even though these changes affect who can buy a firearm, how fast you can get one, what parts are now restricted, how you can transport what you already own, and even what the government can now presume about your intent just from the way you store or purchase legal components. And the most dangerous part is that none of this came from Congress. None of this came from a national debate. And none of this came with a clear warning, because these are court rulings, emergency stays, and enforcement green lights that took effect immediately, which means millions of people can become non-compliant overnight without ever changing their behavior, without ever breaking what they thought was the law, and without ever being told that the law itself just shifted under their feet. Before we go any further, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and follow us so you don't miss updates like this, because these changes are happening fast, they are happening quietly, and they directly affect your rights, your legal risk, and your everyday decisions as a gun owner. The first change is the expansion of constructive possession, which is a legal doctrine that allows the government to argue that you possess something even if it is not physically assembled or immediately usable. And courts have now allowed a much broader interpretation of this concept, meaning that owning parts that could be assembled into a restricted firearm can now be treated the same as owning the restricted firearm itself, even if those parts are stored in different rooms, even if they were purchased months or years apart, and even if you never intended to assemble them. So what used to be a physical measurement standard has quietly become an intent standard, and intent is subjective, intent is inferred, and intent is much harder to defend against than a ruler and a checklist. The second change is the expansion of background check obligations through court interpretation, not through legislation, where courts are now allowing federal agencies to treat more private sales, more informal transfers, and more repeated personal sales as regulated activity, meaning the old line between private citizen and licensed dealer is becoming thinner, blurrier, and far more dangerous. Because you do not need to run a store, you do not need a sign, and you do not need a business license to suddenly be accused of being engaged in the business of selling firearms. The third change is that courts are now allowing new federal gun rules to be enforced while they are still being challenged, which flips the traditional idea of judicial review on its head, because instead of rules being paused until courts decide whether they are lawful, the rules now go into effect first and are sorted out later. And if you violate them in the meantime, even unknowingly, you still face penalties, which means the burden of legal uncertainty is no longer on the government. It is now on you. The fourth change is that unfinished frames, receivers, and parts kits are now being treated as completed firearms in more situations, even if they cannot fire, even if they are incomplete, and even if they still require significant work, which means ordering certain kits online or owning certain components can now trigger the same legal obligations as buying a fully serialized firearm from a dealer, including paperwork, transfers, and in some cases, criminal liability for simple possession. The fifth change is the ongoing chaos around pistol braces, where enforcement is blocked in some jurisdictions, allowed in others, paused again in some, and revived again in others, creating a legal minefield where the same object can be legal on one side of a state line and a felony on the other, and where traveling with the same firearm configuration can turn a law-abiding person into a federal defendant simply by crossing into a different court's territory. The sixth change is the quiet return of magazine capacity limits in certain states, after appellate courts issued emergency stays, meaning magazines that were legal last month are illegal this month, sometimes with no grandfathering, no buyback, no compensation, just a deadline and a threat of prosecution, which forces people to either surrender lawfully purchased property or risk becoming criminals for keeping what they already own. The seventh change is the expansion of red flag-style procedures through judicial interpretation that lowers evidentiary thresholds, shortens hearing timelines, and speeds up temporary seizure processes, meaning orders can now be issued with less notice, less opportunity to contest them immediately, and greater reliance on precaution rather than proof, which fundamentally shifts the balance between safety and due process. The eighth change is the widening of the legal definition of a firearm dealer, where courts are allowing the government to treat repeated personal sales as commercial activity even when there is no profit motive. Meaning, selling several firearms in a year to fund a new purchase, pay a bill, or reorganize a collection can now trigger licensing obligations and criminal exposure. The ninth change is increased scrutiny on suppressors and NFA-regulated items through enforcement policies that courts decline to block, adding layers of transport rules, storage expectations, and reporting obligations even for people who already complied with federal registration and tax requirements. The 10th change is the growing use of digital purchase records, payment processor data, shipping records, and online platform logs in firearm investigations, which courts are increasingly allowing to be accessed through subpoenas and compliance agreements, meaning your digital footprint now plays a much larger role in how gun laws are enforced than ever before. The 11th change is the narrowing of interstate transport protections, where courts are allowing states more room to enforce their own technical standards on people merely passing through, which means a locked case that was previously sufficient may no longer be sufficient everywhere, and a stop for gas, food, or a hotel can expose you to legal risk you never expected. The 12th change is the reactivation of age-based restrictions in certain jurisdictions while legal challenges are still ongoing, meaning young adults who were previously lawful buyers can now be blocked again, depending entirely on which court controls their state. Now imagine how this plays out in real life. Imagine a normal person who bought a pistol brace 2 years ago when it was legal, ordered a parts kit during a sale because it was advertised as legal, and sold 2 old rifles privately to pay for a new optic. And imagine that person traveling across state lines to visit family, stopping overnight in a hotel, and being pulled over for a broken taillight. Because under the new interpretations, that person could face questions about unregistered firearms, unlicensed dealing, illegal possession of parts, or improper transport. Not because they tried to break the law, but because the law moved around them faster than they could track. This is the core danger of the current moment. Not that one specific rule exists, but that the rules are unstable, fragmented, and increasingly enforced before they are settled, which creates a legal environment where compliance is no longer about knowing the law, but about constantly chasing it. So what should you do right now? You should document everything. Keep receipts, serial numbers, dates, and proof of when you acquired items, because timing matters. You should check your specific state and your specific federal circuit, not national headlines, because what is blocked in one place may be enforced in another. You should avoid selling, transferring, or modifying firearms unless you are certain it is lawful under current interpretations. And you should consult a qualified firearms attorney if you are unsure, because informal advice cannot protect you from formal charges. Repeat this so it sticks. Courts are now changing gun law faster than Congress. Courts are now changing gun law without votes. And courts are now changing gun law in ways that create legal traps for ordinary people who are trying to comply. The recap is this. Constructive possession is broader. Private sales are riskier. Emergency enforcement is faster. Parts kits are treated like guns. Braces are unstable legally. Magazines are being re-banned. Red flag procedures are faster. Dealer definitions are wider. Suppressor rules are tighter. Digital records are more accessible. Transport protections are weaker. And age rules are shifting again. Stay informed, stay cautious, and stay legally protected. Because in a system where the rules move quietly and quickly, the only real defense is awareness. And if you found this useful, Like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with another gun owner, and stay with us. Because the law is changing fast, and the cost of not knowing is higher than ever.